So over the next billion seconds, everything that is touched by money, all of economics, is going to be transformed by this new technology. That's why we call that series Cryptonomics. And so when you look beyond the ripples produced by the rise and fall of any particular cryptocurrency, what you see is another wave. You see a tsunami rolling in that's going to roll over banks, it's going to roll over stock markets, it's going to roll over nations. Now there is a lot of hype here. There's a lot of hype in what I said. Some of the hype is justified. It's a new way of thinking about business, and it will force businesses as old and established as banking to adapt to it. Tonight, we're going to be talking to the one person who, probably more than any other, is bringing that world into being. It's a future that we can feel today. Let me tell you how. So, particularly at this time of year, there's a fair few folks who come to me and say, my kid is going to uni. What should he study? What should she study? And really, what they're asking is, what skills will my child need to stay relevant in a world that is changing faster than it ever has before? And okay, that is a good question to ask a futurist. If a futurist can't answer that, that's probably not a good futurist. You know what I tell them? I say, okay, kid's going to uni, dual degree. Two options: finance and computer science, or law and computer science. Why? Because in the middle of those sits the smart contract. And the smart contract, well, that's what money, that's what finance, and that's what law is all becoming. Okay, so what's a smart contract? Well, you're going to hear the term used a bit this evening. In simplest terms, you can think of it as money with rules. Rules that have literally been written into the money. For example, do you have children who receive an allowance? Well, you could write it into their allowance that until the bins get put out and the lawn gets mowed and the rooms are cleaned, they can have the money, but they can't spend it. Or, well, there's a Sydney startup called CryptoFlip. CryptoFlip allows you to make a wager against someone else, a winner-take-all coin toss. Coin toss, there you go. Both of you could play the game. One could win, one could lose. And there's no casino involved. There's no house. Why? Because the rules of the wager are literally written into the money that you're wagering. We don't think about money this way now. We will. Because in the next billion seconds, this is how money is going to work. Money is going to be smart. Money is going to have a mind of its own. Money is going to be busy doing its own thing. And that's a very weird world. That world is right next door. Now there's one person, more than any other, who is responsible for bringing this world into being. If we're entering the age of the smart contract, then it's a fair call that we're starting to walk into a world that is created by our guest this evening. It's a fair call to call him the Godfather of Ethereum. And in ConsenSys, he's putting his bets on the future of the smart contract as an integral and indispensable part of the financial and legal systems of the 21st century. How he got here, where he wants to take us, that's our topic tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Lubin to Cryptonomics Live. So we're in a university. You've been to university. You went to Princeton. What did you study at university? Did it have any relevance to what you're doing now?
sure. Electrical engineering, computer science.
Okay, so there you go. So there's that foundation there. And how did that then sort of lead you into the world that you're in today? Because you said you left university to become a professional squash player.
For 5 minutes, yeah. So I left university because when you graduate, they don't let you live there anymore. I did decide to tour around a little bit and play some squash tournaments, and ended up back on campus. I was playing a tournament in Philadelphia, about an hour away from campus, and so I just visited some friends on campus and stayed on campus for a couple nights, and ended up running into a professor there who he was a squash fan, but he was also in the engineering department, and he sort of ran the robotics lab and was doing some neural nets research. And I had done my thesis on AI. It was more symbolic AI, but I was hanging out in the cognitive science laboratory as a junior and as a senior, and the sort of rebirth of the neural networks.
Renaissance, right.
The Renaissance was happening right around then, and there was a cool researcher or two who was building out a project and had all these neural nets papers lying around, and so I sort of got into that, fell into that for about 10 years. I did work in robotics and machine vision and neural nets, and so that was the early phase of my tech career, and got more general, and then blockchain was unrelated, or sort of a natural evolution if you look at it from a certain perspective.
Well, because you were building autonomous robots, right? And so autonomous robots they're distributed systems. They need to be able to act on their own and connect, in your head.
In a very different way. So they're autonomous systems, but they're not necessarily decentralized or distributed compute infrastructures.
Okay, so
it's very centralized.
So, all right, so sort of old school, the way we used to design robots, but robots are now more informed by what we understand by distributed
a swarm or a flock. It was just a set of processors on essentially a model vehicle, model car.
Now, how did you start to execute, not so much a pivot, but a broadening of your experience from computer science now into finance, which landed you, at Goldman Sachs?
So that was an accident. I did work at Goldman Sachs for a while, but that was still on the technology side of things. So it was on the IT side of private wealth management. I was essentially running a project that was a CRM project that touched on lots of different departments, and so coordinating a bunch of tools to enable those tools, defining portfolios, rebalancing portfolios, etc., for the private wealth managers so that they could use those tools for their customers. And so I just learned about the finance world when I was there. I wasn't very finance savvy and really couldn't care about that world very much. I was much more interested in science and technology, and thought the other stuff was sort of a waste of time. But I did begin to get fascinated with it, and got much more deeply into it when a friend of mine, after Goldman, asked me, he was basically running a strategy in-house with a wealthy family, and they got greedy, felt that they could run the strategy themselves. They chopped down his percentage, and he said, I can do this on my own, and we were actually squash friends, just living back. I know you might do that.
The story.
Exactly. And we, essentially he asked me to help him build out the back office of this endeavor, and we ended up, he liked, sleeping till noon and getting up and figuring things out and placing trades at 4, and so having a partner was really valuable to him, and we ended up, he ended up asking me essentially to be effectively a partner in that endeavor. So we ran his strategy, which was an extremely effective strategy for quite a while, and that caused me to start paying attention to the big game, finance, economics, geopolitics, etc., because we were essentially managing people's money, and it depended on knowing what was going on in the world.
So as you, I guess, pivoted, transition, broadened from something that was more engineering science-centric to engineering science, now finance, and I guess with a much more larger global perspective, did that, is that when you started to see that maybe there are interesting ways to use engineering to change the way the world works?
No. No. So the interesting thing about that phase of my career is that it sort of forced me to understand what was going on, what systems we were all embedded in, centralized systems, monetary systems that I felt were end-of-lifing. And so I began to get concerned and disillusioned and then kind of depressed about the state of the financial geopolitics.
So sort of the financial world is kind of like an ATM that's running Windows XP. Right.
Something like that.
You know, it's sitting there, it's chugging along. Microsoft stopped supporting it about 10 years ago, and
pretty much,
it can be hacked pretty easily.
Or just collapse. Yeah.
Or just stop working.
Exactly. So I was concerned about that, and I guess the disillusionment led me to sort of check out for a little while. Spent some time in Jamaica.
This is quoted in your Cyber's bio, and I have this image. We should really have dub music filling the room, and then maybe a little ganja smoke coming in, because you have this period when you were working in the music industry in Jamaica, which is this kind of trope. So
I was helping a friend with her music career, and wasn't working extremely hard in the music industry. And it's not like I was significant in the music industry in any way down there. So she had a lot of friends who were significant in the music industry, and we were able to set up a little studio and make songs and videos. So it was pretty fun. And then essentially Ethereum happened, and it was very hard to participate intensely in the Ethereum project from a small Caribbean island.
although given the tax status of many small Caribbean islands, perhaps that could have been interesting. So let's back up just a little bit, because Ethereum is kind of a fully evolved part of our story, but from around, so we're coming up to this 10-year anniversary of the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper, what I call the ultimate internet mic drop. Here's this entirely new financial system, bye. When did you learn about Bitcoin, distributed ledger technology, blockchain, all of this? Do you remember when you heard about it?
Sure. So I encountered it a very small handful of times on Slashdot in early 2011.
Okay.
I decided I should download the paper and read it. So immediately was pretty moved by it. Immediately it kind of flipped me from being disillusioned to quite optimistic.
This is not the first time I've heard someone say this. What was that? What is that thing? If you can think about what caused that switch to flip, what was that? Put that in words for us.
Because I felt we were in a slow cascading collapse of economic and political systems. It felt like there was much too much debt in the system than money. I felt like there were three paths forward. One was slow cascading collapse. Central bankers would kick the can down the road, devalue the currencies for a very long time. That would be a very low growth regime for 20 years or so, as we paid off debt with huge buckets of devalued money.
In other words, what happened in 2008 and 2009 and 2010?
Yeah, it's still happening. So unfortunately, actually fortunately, because hopefully we can kick the can down the road for another decade or so, and then replace the older systems with better systems. The other option was the collapse goes nonlinear. It happens very fast. Some sort of event happens and a contagion.
Which was the same danger in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman.
Yes, it happened. Could have been much worse. And the third option was some invention, free energy, instant teleportation, something like that would be a growth engine that would enable us to grow our way out of.
I'm just looking in case anyone in the room is working on that. Please speak to one of us afterward.
This gentleman's working on that. He was like, yes. So we got something not quite so powerful, but maybe as powerful. So blockchain represents not an instantaneous growth engine, but a way of building alternative infrastructure, building a different, more trustworthy foundation on which we can rebuild lots of systems.
Okay, so we have that. You have your moment. You take a look at distributed ledger blockchain, this entire sort of set of things that are in that original white paper. When did you start to get a sense that this is interesting, but it's not enough? It's the beginning, but it's not where we need to go, and it needs to grow into something that has more facility to it. In other words, that in a way that a smart contract is not just a blockchain, but it's a blockchain plus code plus a distributed compute. It's got all of the pieces in it. When did you start to become aware that what we had was interesting, but that was a beginning rather than the end?
So I never really thought of it that way. It was always a progression. It's like, this is great. And it came so fast. It was incredibly slow if you look back from how fast things are now. But we were very naive. These ideas were very new. We didn't understand what we understand now. And so it was just a natural progression of ideas. Cryptocurrency, wow. We didn't even understand that there was this thing called crypto economics. We just knew that this system, elegantly mechanism designed, incentivizes people to contribute their resources to validate transactions, secure the network, and make the system work. That was quite a revelation to start with, and we were happy with that revelation. Bitcoin was going to be the end all and be all. It would transform everything. In 2012 and going forward, lots of people started to realize that it's kind of a database technology, and we should use this better, more trustworthy infrastructure and build not just this narrow money application on it, but we should build other sorts of systems. So systems like crowdfunding or gambling or something like that. Those are like the innovative use cases that people came up with back then. And in order to implement those use cases, you essentially had to be a protocol priest. You needed to add some opcodes at the protocol level, or you could do something at the client level, and that just wasn't scalable in terms of human action. When I read Vitalik's white paper, I read about a proposal for a platform that would separate the protocol layer from the application layer, and it was easy to contemplate building developer tools, building infrastructure that would enable essentially millions of software developers to operate very happily, solving their own problems at the application layer, while the protocol priests continue to improve the plumbing.
Okay, so let me unroll this a little bit so we don't lose anyone in the audience. Vitalik is here, and we'll come to him in a second. But what you're talking about is creating, in the same way that the internet has packets going underneath it, and you kind of don't have to worry about how the packets get from point A to point B, because when they get into whatever app, whether it's a web browser or FaceTime or whatever, the application knows what they want to do with them. So you can have all of these applications using a similar, a common communications framework. You're now talking about doing that around a blockchain, where all of these blockchains can be using the same blockchain, but using it all in different ways.
That's very well said.
So how did you then meet Vitalik? You met him when he was 19 years old, and you know the date.
So January 1st, 2014, like I usually do, I was visiting my parents at home in Toronto over Christmas.
Good boy.
And he's he is also a Torontonian or of Russian birth. I think he left Russia around age 6 and grew up in Toronto.
Okay, so you met this, I'll just call it genius 18-year-old, and he had just written a white paper in which he talked about taking this and putting this layer up so people can do all the crazy stuff they want, and there can be this very stable thing underneath that provides the support for it. And what did you say to him? You're like, oh, this is a great idea, let's go make it happen?
I listened to him. I didn't really say very much.
Okay.
So I was, there was another founder of Ethereum, Anthony Diorio, who was running a meetup. He invited me to listen to Vitalik. He told me that Vitalik, who I was aware of because he was running something called Bitcoin Magazine. He was an incredibly lucid writer, and I read a lot about Bitcoin, learned a fair amount from him over a year or two before I even realized that he was in high school. I obviously had a lot of respect for him.
On the internet, no one knows you're in high school.
Yeah. I was immediately very interested in speaking to him, went to the meetup, and we spoke for a little while. I listened a bunch, and he sent me the white paper. That evening I read it, and a group of people who were attracted to the project stayed in contact via Skype and other mechanisms for the next couple weeks, and we organized getting together in Miami, where Vitalik was slated to deliver his paper at the North American Bitcoin Conference, essentially announcing Ethereum. And it was already a big deal at that point. There were lots of people in the blockchain space. It was a pretty tight community. I wasn't really part of that community up to that point.
That was
my relationship to Bitcoin was reading everything basically up to that point. So we had this house, and there were always 20 or so people hanging around talking about Ethereum, and mostly Ethereum. He ended up delivering the talk in a very big room, double the size of this room maybe, and it was already 6 people deep, standing room only at the back, so it was already happening.
So it was a moment. And did that then lead to the Ethereum Foundation immediately after that?
Not immediately after that. So we were actually going to do the token launch on the Tuesday after our time in Miami, and we realized that was probably not a prudent move. It looked like we were going to have lots of Bitcoin nouveau riche people drop a lot of Bitcoin on the project, and we didn't really have a sale mechanism, and we didn't have a cold storage hot wallet system. And oh, by the way, what if the SEC in the United States considers this a sale of unregistered securities to Americans?
Yeah.
And so we built all that stuff, and I did the bulk of the work with lawyers to define what Ether was, define what the platform was, get the lawyers up to speed, and create an argument that they got behind very strongly. It's a fairly prestigious law firm in the United States, basically promoting the idea that this was essentially a consumer utility token. We didn't call it that. I think we called it a utility token sometimes, but that it would not be considered a security.
That you weren't buying shares. In other words, because that's when the SEC would have lost their mind. All right. Anne has already sort of tipped her hand about the Mark Pesce token. Thank you. But this is, the Mark Pesce token was a way to be able to think about making time liquid and what that would be. It was more of a thought experiment than anything else, but it was interesting. But one of the things that made it easy to do is that when Ethereum came out, because of this stable understructure and this very mutable overstructure, it's possible now for pretty much anyone to spin up their own cryptocurrency. We call them tokens when they're in Ethereum. And we saw it was a big bang, an explosion of all sorts of different types of tokens. And that explosion is not so much slowing down other than the SEC just sort of checking things to make sure that everyone's not selling securities, but that they're actually doing utility tokens. But we're seeing an increasing number.
Or if they're selling securities, they're registering
that
them,
they've done paperwork.
or there's some exemption that they're making use of.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They're making sure that people have done their homework on this.
Operating within the law.
But we are seeing an accelerating number of tokens being created for a whole bunch of different purposes, some of which are financial instruments, others are bookkeeping, others are record keeping, just like you name it. Are we moving toward a world where the number of tokens is effectively infinite and we have a currency, and I'm going to use that in quotes, because we kind of don't get, that's a placeholder word for something that we're seeing coming out, where we have that for almost every kind of thing.
I do believe we are moving into a Mark Pesce kind of world. There's
Oh dear Lord, people.
Yeah, so it makes sense to build these network business models, these protocol-based open platforms. Ethereum is a protocol-based open platform. You can write an application on Ethereum, and that application can itself be a protocol-based open platform. So we can stand up a protocol-based open platform that serves as infrastructure for an adjacent music industry where our artists put their wares up, and you can get licenses, you can pay them in real time, and you could essentially build lots of businesses on that open platform. That sort of network business should probably have its own business logic, its own medium of exchange potentially. It shouldn't necessarily be subject to the baggage of the platform on which it sits. So I'm not saying Ether has negative baggage. I'm saying that the dynamics of Ether shouldn't necessarily affect the dynamics of the value token that glues together the ecosystems that are built upon it. And so makes a ton of sense for any project to define its own token, whether it's a share or consumer utility token or a digitally scarce asset like a sword, or that you can move between games. So I think we'll see essentially a qualitative difference between how many tokens and how value tokens are created from the legacy world to this natively digital world. And the problem there is that we're going to have so many of these tokens. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with them effectively? And I think that probably leads us to a situation where we have wallets, smart agents,
And lots of exchanges.
So definitely lots of ways of making exchange, of figuring out what exchange rates are between tokens. So I could, for instance, have a wallet, and that enables me to prioritize which tokens I want to get rid of first. And you'd have
That's the crap money. I'm spending that first. This is the good money I'm holding on to.
Exactly, yeah. Gresham's law. Yeah. And you would have a point of sale or something, which indicated which ones you'd want to receive first, and our wallets would talk to one another. I wouldn't even think about whether I want to use Beyonce tickets or Euro or banana tokens or anything like that. I would just think, okay, I want to buy that thing, and my intelligent agent would converse with yours, and
They would haggle.
we'd get that. They'd haggle maybe. We'd get that done. If we didn't have an effective mapping between our two wallets, then we could go off to a service and have them make an exchange and take a little fee in order to get that transaction done.
Okay,
So
so
it really abstracts things. So yes, there's so many more tokens, but we're not really thinking about those tokens so much anymore.
yeah, that's also true. One of the things this is pointing out is that it's very easy to get systems that are quite rich And I mean that in the sense of having lots of pieces. And we saw very early on the digital
I mean, more pieces than the Federal Reserve System?
Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, banking infrastructure, and those are...
But those pieces are, how shall I put it, reasonably well debugged. And
You really wanted to stick with that? Let's drop it.
in the sense that they've failed several times and been fixed, which is how almost all debugging works. We have the example of the Digital Autonomous Organization, which I thought was an amazing project, just essentially a venture capital fund that raised about $150 million in Ether. That could then, the members who had put that money in could then nominate the projects that they wanted to invest in, and then there would essentially be no carry, which is the percentage that a venture capitalist gets from earnings of their investment. And it was designed to be decentralized, there was no board or anything like this, and they flipped the switch on it, and within 6 hours, bugs had been found, I think, both in the code and in the Ethereum layer underneath. There were no bugs in the Ethereum layer underneath.
Definitely not.
So bugs were found in the code, and someone had managed to siphon away $50 million from this
But
project.
it didn't happen that fast. What did happen fast was a call to halt this crazy project. And Gunsir at Cornell and Vlad Samfir and another guy wrote a paper called to sort of suspend the activity because they were concerned that something was going to go very wrong. And Emin had a grad student, I'm forgetting which one it was, who identified the actual flaw, and they looked at it and they couldn't figure out a way to really exploit it. So they're like, no, it's not a big deal at this point. But a lot of people were very concerned. Some people at ConsenSys were very excited about the project, and I was excited about the project just because it was this big thing. But I also was much more concerned about the project than excited, and I would rather have not had it foisted into the world so early. I thought we weren't really ready for something that big.
I mean, what does that tell us about being humble enough to start with small things and get those working well before we go on to the big thing?
The people who put that project together didn't anticipate that it would grow so quickly.
That would be so successful.
Yeah, exactly. They were running an experiment. They thought that they could essentially fund their project through it, Slockit, and other projects too. So it was a way to fund what they wanted to do and essentially run a very interesting experiment at the same time. They tried to be prudent about it. They clearly didn't security audit it as well as they should have, and it's some smart people on the project. It is so unlikely that something like that would get through right now because we've got still a lot more expertise in security auditing projects like that.
Now, one of my friends who's very smart in this space, I asked him before, why does it market 6,000 lines of code? When was the last time we wrote 6,000 lines with no bugs? And I was like, there we are. Okay, you mentioned ConsenSys, so you get Ethereum off the ground. How soon afterward do you start ConsenSys? And what is, Blockchain Venture Studio is what you call it. What does that mean?
A year into the Ethereum project, we were getting close to, I thought we were getting close to launching the platform. And that's roughly when I started contemplating at least and putting a small number of people together to form ConsenSys. So it really did start officially, legally in late 2014, but we really got going in 2015. It was essentially because we were, there was nobody, or very few people were building anything at the application layer. So we were going to release this platform and there wasn't going to be a lot going on the platform. So I figured I'd get started in doing some of that. It ended up being a bunch more months before the platform was actually released. So we ended up operating for quite a while, essentially on test nets and no real platform, no real ecosystem.
Okay, all right. So you got in there in preparation for being able to build applications.
Yeah, so we thought it was 2 weeks away, the launch of the platform, but those 2 weeks multiplied quite a bit.
So what kinds of applications are you focused on building on this platform at ConsenSys?
Many. So we built developer tools like the Truffle Suite. We have been responsible for building 3 of the clients, the Java client, the Haskell client, and the next Java client, which will be officially announced very soon, a few days from now. We built infrastructure like Infura and MetaMask, enabling people to essentially release and access applications from the browser. In the olden days, if you wanted to get your client to use your application, not that there were that many applications out there, but what you essentially had to do was tell your customer to go to GitHub and download the Ethereum client and wait for 8 hours or 3 days for it to sync, and then you can type your URL into the browser, and you would connect on the machine via RPC or IPC, and that's the way, of course, to build a healthy ecosystem.
Hands up the number of people in this room who did that. Bless you
A
all.
lot of people, that's great.
It's a good room.
So MetaMask and Infura have made that easier, and Infura is a tremendous tool, an amazing team that powers a lot of our ecosystem, but we're working pretty hard to try to decentralize all of that, to turn Infura into a protocol so that it's not a bottleneck for our industry. We started out with the idea of being a venture production studio, and we were essentially going to build some POCs, wrap a company around them, and put them out for external investment, and that's how we would grow. And we started with an accounting system and an app store, some other proof of location application, other little experiments. We realized that the guy who was building the App Store, Tim Coulter, started building these scripts to enable him to more efficiently develop, and that turned into Truffle Suite. So that's his main focus. It's been his main focus for a long time. The Infura team started by building test networks for our different internal projects, and by the time of DevCon 2 in Shanghai, they decided to externalize that to enable third-party projects to make use of that infrastructure, and it's gone through many different iterations over time. So it's been of necessity that we built lots of these things. The Venture Production Studio continues. It's one of our 4 focuses, and we have a group called Labs that identifies projects externally, brings them in-house. We identify projects in various ways internally, and we ask them to present their ideas to a resource allocation circle, and perhaps fund those projects. So Labs is good at taking projects and helping them mature. Some of them can mature to the point where they're commercially successful, to the point where they externalize and maybe get some venture capital, or potentially token launch themselves. So we have a group called Token Foundry that helps with consumer utility tokens, and another group that's spinning out of Token Foundry that's called ConsenSys Digital Securities.
Okay, so here we are sort of crossing the line back again into finance from computer science. But a lot of what you talked about is building basic infrastructure so that you and everyone else can build things. Which makes sense, because if this is now an entirely new foundation for an entirely new kind of computer science, which is kind of how we're thinking of it now, then we are going to have a new level of tools invention. I mean, we saw this again in the 1970s with microcomputing, and then in the 1990s with the web, where you saw completely new tools infrastructures for every new thing that was coming up.
So networking before that, then the web, then mobile.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, now you see smart contracts as a force for good in the world. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Did I say that? So yeah, I can.
Do you want to own that, or I don't want to put words in your
Sure.
mouth?
So I see it as a technology that could be used for mostly good, but potentially evil as well.
Guns point both ways, absolutely.
Sure. So I see it as a revolution. Blockchain, smart contracts built on blockchain, a revolution in the trust infrastructure. So essentially we've built societies. Societies are systems of rules and ledgers, and those rules are defined by people and implemented, enforced, sometimes well, sometimes capriciously by these top-down command and control infrastructures where you have either a monarch or elected leaders who operate through a pyramid of different actors that are essentially under that singular control. And it works reasonably well in many places. I think it's the optimal organizing principle when communication is slow and expensive and decision making is therefore slow and expensive, but we have tremendous communication networks now, and we have this breakthrough technology that enables us to make decisions within 10 minutes or 15 seconds, depending on your platform, soon even more quickly, even if up to half of the actors in your system are malicious.
Or bad, right?
With these ConsenSys, these decision-making algorithms. And so we can start to contemplate what it's like to have flatter organizations.
And presumably also more transparent. In other words, inspectably
Absolutely.
transparent around how the decision is made.
Exactly. And so blockchain, smart contracts essentially turn subjective trust into automated trust and essentially guaranteed execution of the rule systems or the agreements that we make. So rule systems meaning potentially laws or rules on one of those network business model protocol-based open platforms, agreements in the form of potentially legally enforceable agreements. We have a project called Open Law that type Open Law into YouTube. There's a whole bunch of really cool demos that essentially enable us to move lots of the expense into these agreements on the blockchain. You can post the whole agreement on the blockchain so that it's visible, it's transparent, or you can create a digital digest of an agreement and create signatures to that agreement and post that to the blockchain, essentially memorializing, timestamping that agreement was in place without disclosing any of the details of that agreement. And so we're moving from a world of these static agreements to a world in which these agreements can be dynamic. They can be clauses of prose and some clauses of programmatic elements. We can escrow money into them, we can send data into them, and they can act when certain conditions are met. And so pretty exciting way of slowly, very carefully in layers architecting things. So we built thousands of years of technology in different niches, in law, in accounting, in materials science, and building science, and now we can basically take all of that and potentially reposition it on a much less flimsy, much less subjective foundation, the trust layer.
So this is good. This is basically my last question. We're going to go to you guys after this question, so start picking up some good questions for Joe. What does the future look like? In what time frame do we start to see smart contracts and this sort of evolution into this new system become a significant force economically and culturally? You know, I think in the billion second time frame, so that's 30 years. And I can see 30 years from now, absolutely, but is it closer than that?
Depends who you are. For people I know, it's happening now.
You run a service crowd there.
We're building the infrastructure that will enable essentially the evolution of the internet, the evolution of the web. The internet and the web have been about information. They've been about e-commerce and social, but blockchain will, because of this trust layer, will enable natively digital elements to be the foundational elements of our society. So it can be money, it can be identity and reputation and legal enforceable agreements and certificates, other kinds of financial instruments. So all of the elements that we use that have essentially analog elements, frictional elements, when they're involved in transactions, those transactions clear and settle over hours, days, and weeks, and now they're going to be able to clear in the instant of the transaction. So that's going to be quite transformative. The people who are using these 1,000 different components that we're building and maturing are builders. So they're the people who are building the next better system, or are composing 5 of these things into something that other builders can use. So we're certainly going to have some breakthroughs in gaming, perhaps in journalism, perhaps in other spaces where more normal human beings start to use blockchain-based systems. But I'm pretty happy for us to focus on another year or 2 of the infrastructure, and the consumers will come.
So 2020, 2021, not that far out. Sort of 100 days.
I think we'll have some exciting consumer breakthroughs in 2019, but it'll be around the edges. It'll be safer things. It could be lending, could be insurance. Will definitely be gaming. Will be exchanges. The civil project is one of what I think is the most important projects around, because the journalism industry is morally bankrupt. It's collapsing.
That's the problem.
The business models are collapsing. It's not sustainable. It's not ethical. And a platform like Civil can maybe focus our attention on it and give different newsrooms that commit to being ethical a boost, potentially.
All right, folks, question time for you guys. Who's got the first question? Hand did go up. So, Alex, no, that's fine. We got microphones.
Hello,
Hi
thanks
there.
Laura, thanks Joseph. My name is Melissa. I'm from the blockchain project called Tendora. We started off wanting to build new solutions that's going to work on interoperability, but over time we're now super focused on Ethereum. So I guess my question is about how big of an Ethereum maximist are you, Joseph? Would you consider would you consider anyone not building on Ethereum to be doing a disservice to the blockchain industry, or do you still think there's some credence?
All right, and we should be clear that Ethereum is not the only smart contract platform out there. For those of you who don't know, that question was kind of like, should we all focus on one, or can there be many?
So I and everybody in the Ethereum ecosystem understands that it's a very immature ecosystem, and 5 years, 10 years from now, the architectures will be very different. So we need many people exploring the solution space, and we talk with lots of projects. There are a good handful of good projects out there that are essentially competing directly with Ethereum. So there's a lot of collaboration between different projects. Dfinity, Archain, less with Cardano, but they're doing interesting work. Zilliqa, so very good projects out there. I think, in my opinion, which is biased, the Ethereum ecosystem is so big compared to any of those ecosystems, and it's growing exponentially. For every feature in any of those projects, like a pure functional language or a governance system, there are 7 projects in the Ethereum space that are exploring that sort of thing. I feel like Ethereum 2.0 and other projects with similar scalability are going to hit roughly at the same time. Ethereum 2.0 is probably 12 months away from a testnet, let's say. In the meantime, we have state channels in ZK Snarks and ZK Starks and TrueBit and side chains via Plasma or other mechanisms. Sorry, do you want to unpack all that technology?
No.
Dark.
No. But what's
called
saying
dark.
is there's a lot of development going on.
So layer 2 technologies, which are online now and coming online incredibly quickly, there's so many people working on different approaches to that, are going to give us thousands, tens of thousands of transactions per second in terms of scalability, and I think they're going to tide us over, while Ethereum 2.0, which increases scalability at the base layer, gets built out. So Ethereum 2.0 is already, it's not 100% defined, but it's 90-something% defined, and different groups are building Ethereum 2.0 currently. But Ethereum 5 years from now is going to look very different. I'm confident that there will be an Ethereum. I think it's here to stay. It will remain significant, but there are a lot of smart people out there building cool things, so there'll be other things out there as well.
Okay, so you want to, Jess? You're welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Joseph. My name is Jess Spelling. I'm a counsellor in the city of Sydney. So I'm particularly interested in the democratic applications of smart contracts and this technology. And I know in the US in particular there have been huge problems with voter suppression, and as well as people's fears around hacking of voting machines and things like that in the upcoming election. Is there anything that you're working on around voter identification and ways of verifying the democratic processes?
So we're working on some things in that space. It's less about the voting mechanisms than it is about identity. So if you solve identity, then people can vote, and you can do liquid democracy or quadratic voting. You can get very, very sophisticated.
How do we solve for identity and don't end up with a social credit system like they have in China?
So it's about enabling people to establish their own identity or the root of their identity on the blockchain such that they are fully in control of it. We have a project called Uport. There are other projects out there that are taking similar approaches on different platforms. Sovereign is one of them. We can all right now establish our Uport based identity. It conforms to the architecture put out by the Decentralized Identity Foundation. We're a founding member. Microsoft and a bunch of other companies are founding members, and it's blockchain agnostic, and it's even sort of technology agnostic too. You don't really need a blockchain for your decentralized identity. It's sort of based on public key infrastructure, I can essentially establish my identity. I can disclose it. I can register it in different ways if I want to. Associated with that, I can have a personal data locker so that I can encrypt data that I really care about, the valuable stuff, the stuff that I'm not comfortable spraying across the internet to access Google's and Facebook's and other services. And that information will be encrypted and selectively disclosable by me in situations that I designate. So the infrastructure's there. It's not super mature. We've had a few iterations of it. It's getting very usable. So solving identity is important. Voting systems are not so hard. We've had cryptographic voting systems where you get a receipt and you can essentially know that you voted correctly, or that your vote was registered correctly and it was counted, basically. So that's a technology that's sort of independent of blockchain, but can be used profitably with blockchain. other interesting approaches that we're taking is in the United States they have this political action committee structure, or super PACs, where you can put a whole bunch of money into this organization, and you could potentially incentivize politicians to do things.
That's such a polite way of putting it.
Yeah, so one crazy thing that you can incentivize them to do is to represent their constituency.
Now that's actually a crazy job right there.
And so we're trying to put together this infrastructure that will reward certain politicians for essentially voting the way that their constituents vote. So mechanisms to enable the different people in a constituency to vote, and rewards for carrying out the will of the people.
All right, next question. The young lady in the back had her hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Subha, and I happen to be a scientist, and then I have a biotech company which is into drug discovery and development back in India. I'm just wondering, any thoughts around integrating your blockchain technology into drug discovery and development? Because it's again a futuristic kind of a domain that I belong to. So, question please.
So I don't think blockchains are good at discovering drugs right now. Some people I know who build blockchains are fairly good at that. So AI is certainly an interesting technology for that. It may be useful for funding such endeavors, or registering intellectual property around those endeavors, but we're not currently working in that domain.
Next question. So I guess.
Hi, Joe. I'm Sven Meyer. I work as a technology consultant for many years in Germany. Recently migrated to Australia, and I was wondering what the plans are for ConsenSys in Australia.
So we have a pretty sizable group in Brisbane, and and a group in Sydney as well. So we're doing some work here.
And so this ConsenSys has groups all over the world pretty much now, doesn't it? I mean, was that always the intention, that not only were you going to work on distributed apps, but you were going to be a distributed company around?
Yeah, I guess it was sort of a default hypothesis. We started as a essentially multinational startup because that's where the expertise was. There weren't a lot of people around the world that we knew, or weren't a lot of people anywhere, let alone where I was located in New York City at the time, who were expert in this technology. So we hired somebody in Milwaukee and somebody in South Africa, and it proceeded that way pretty quickly.
Okay, so it grew organically as
Yeah.
distributed network of experts.
And we committed fairly early to trying to be a remote-first organization. We do a decent job of that, not a really effective job at that. We probably need better tools to enable people to feel more connected to one another. But that's a hard problem.
That's a hard problem. Okay, this is kind of going to be the last question. So you in the middle had your hand up last time. We can bring the mic around to him. There you go. Just want to get this thing done relatively on time as a courtesy to all of you folks.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, Joseph. My name is Varun Pant. I'm a director IT in a company that I'm running. So, it's a very immature industry at the moment, as I see it, right? So, first it started off as a digital store of, value with Bitcoin, and over a period of time it
I think that was later. I think Bitcoin people felt that it would be the money system for the payment system for the planet,
Yes.
and sort of a backup business plan with store of value. Basically.
Yeah. So that didn't, obviously that didn't quite materialize the way it had to. But that is, I think, because of the maturity, right? Then came Ethereum with smart contracts. But now, there are other things like EOS or NEO. But the real use cases, whenever I talk to people, they think about, there was a question here saying that how can I use blockchain in this? So the real use cases which are there, yes, you're providing a platform, but where are the real use cases that are coming in? I know VeChain is doing something around carbon credits, and there are some companies, but the real adoption is still missing because people are entering cryptocurrencies essentially for speculation, right? That's the way it is currently, and they don't understand. They get burned, and that is actually hindering the advancement of acceptance of cryptocurrency. So where do you think, and when will the adoption come, where the masses can use the blockchain as it should be used in terms of there is one more thing that the question that the City of Sydney person had. There is a company in India where they have voting. There's a political party where they are actually using it for democratic voting on where do I spend money. So sorry, my question is, where do you?
I think I got your question.
Yeah, where is the adoption coming, and where is the real use cases? When is it coming? Thank you.
So adoption is happening amongst hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of builders. It's people who are building out the ecosystem, building the fundamental elements and turning some of those building blocks into sophisticated applications. We have some traction in Meridio, in our project that's tokenizing real estate. We have some traction in Ujo Music, our project that enables artists to register themselves and sell their content to other artists or consumers. Traction in the Bounties Network and Gitcoin that is paying people, incentivizing people to get work done, whether it's writing software or translating documentation. So I could probably name 30 more. None of them are really heavily used right now, but they're used by the people that are building.
Okay, I get the privilege of asking the last question. If you were answering a parent today to say, what should my kids be studying when they go to uni, what would you say to them?
So I think the most powerful degrees are mathematics, physics, computer science. So if you're good at one or all three of those, you can apply that to roughly anything. But really you should study what you love, probably. But get some of those tools too.
Very good advice. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all thank Joe Lubin. On Thursday, we're going to be releasing the interview with Joe on the Cryptonomics podcast, so be sure to have a listen with your favorite podcasting app. If you want to learn more about Joe or ConsenSys or Ethereum, go visit the website at cryptonomics.show. You're going to find everything you need to go deeper. That's cryptonomics.show. This very special episode of Cryptonomics Live would not have been possible without a lot of help. From UTS, Margaret Petty, who couldn't be with us tonight, Mary Lou Costa, Aura Lee, Ann Schaefer, and of course, Lynn Whitewick. At the City of Sydney, Alex Curtis and Victoria Moxley, who's back up at the room somewhere, who are part of the city's economic development team, which produces the Visiting Entrepreneur program. Southern Cross Lost Stereo, Cameron Roberts, and Dave, whose name I never learned, so I can't thank you with your last name, for producing a wonderful streaming podcast, and my wonderful producer, Alex Mitchell. Shout out. The next 30 Seconds Cryptonomics is written and presented by Mark Pesce. Created in collaboration with Podcast Lewis Australia, producer Alex Mitchell, and sound production by Matt Nikolich. For more episodes, please go visit podcastone.com.au or you use your favorite podcasting app. This is Mark Pesce, thanking you for listening. I'd like to invite Ann Schaefer back to the stage.